We'll begin by separating the two back canvases so that we are absolutely certain we have a right and a left. Now, if you'll recall, we trimmed the seam allowances off of the back wool padding so that we had some room to work when we're doing our actual seams. We don't want this very thick wool going into the seams because it will distort the way they hang. We'll take a moment and place both pieces of wool in their locations, and then using our thin, weak basting thread, we will take some pretty random tack stitches through the wool and through the canvas to hold it in place so that we can do our pad stitching. Now you'll see me do this half in actually quite a sloppy baste, and I'm doing this intentionally so that you can see that even if you are not observing particularly fussy practices of perfection, you can be really quick and the wool will get held in place and you can still easily pad stitch it well. The level of pretty precision that is often the norm in making clothes and costumes is really not always necessary in favor of speed and accuracy. I think what I'm trying to say is accurate does not necessarily mean visually perfect. With our basting complete, we'll now thread the needle up with a heavier thread that is a little bit darker. I hope you can still see it well. And we'll begin our pad stitches. And we begin these pad stitches along the armhole, just as we did for the front. And we'll do a line of pad stitches, keeping them approximately 1 thumb width in from the cut edge of the material. And we'll work our way up to the shoulder, leaving the top portion of the shoulder free. We don't need to leave much because we've already trimmed it away from the seam allowance, but we do want to have a little bit to move out of the way in case we need to for our stitching. So again, with pad stitching, you turn the work and keep working down the armhole. Once you've done 4 or 5 rows along the armhole, you'll then turn the work and start working back and forth between the center back and the mid shoulder, working horizontally across the piece rather than vertically along the armhole. This changes the contouring of the surface and allows the garment to fall more smoothly over the body over time. These stitches are put in place with the idea that they will move and shift as the garment ages and is worn. It's not always about the perfection of the garment as it's completed, but also about how it's going to break in and how the longevity of the garment is affected by these stitches. As I pad stitch, I'm also using a fairly large stitch, and that's because I don't feel that we need to have a particularly stiff structure for the back pieces like this. The larger and further apart the stitches are placed, the softer the end result. If you put the stitches closer together and make them quite small, it will result in a stiffer, more structured piece. So that's just a little bit of information about pad stitching as we proceed to finish off this shoulder area on the back. Once all of the pad stitching is complete on the pieces, then we'll just run it over with an iron. Now, this will flatten out the pad stitching quite a bit, but the structure that we put into it by curving it and turning it is still there, and as the garment ages and is worn, that shaping will become more useful. Now that the canvas is complete, it's time to baste our exterior on. Now this is very different than how we basted the fronts. The fronts required a lot of sculpting and the backs really don't. So rather than doing a bunch of internal basting like we did with the front, we're just going to line everything up and begin basting around the edges. Now you'll see me smoothing this out as I have pressed it in place on top of the canvas, and that is to give it a slight stretch, because what we want is for the edges of the exterior to match up with the edges of the canvas, even though the canvas is cut slightly larger. And what this will do is it will give the canvas a slight bit of fullness, and that fullness ends up pushing outward on the exterior fabric as the garment is worn and giving it more shape and structure. It also prevents the canvas in any way from pulling at the exterior and changing the way it's shaped. As I've just shown you in the image, you'll notice that as I'm basting along the armhole, I am not catching the wool padding in my basting. And that's because we'll need to do other things with this wool padding later on in the process, and we don't want to stitch it into this point. Something else you'll see is as I'm working, notice how I'm rolling the pieces of the garment in different directions. For the top and the bottom, I will tend to hold the garment quite flat on the tabletop, but when I'm working up center back and along the sides, the garment is rolled in a slightly tubular fashion, as you see here. And what this does is it naturally, how to describe this? It allows the layers to be basted in place in a curved position, similar to how they will sit on the body. And this gives us just a little bit more control over the future of these layers and how they interact with each other. Now, I would say on the back of a garment, it's not tremendously important to do this rolling. I think you could still get away with doing it perfectly flat if you like. But I like to use the assumption that we're helping the garment hold its shape over time by doing it this way. It's more of a principle than a requirement when it comes to the back, but I think it's something that should be observed. So you can see, as we run the iron over the material, that the wool is going to shrink into position and it's going to lie very nicely on top of the canvas. And if you look at the back of the canvas here, you can see that there is a little bit of fullness in that canvas, and that while the exterior is supported, the canvas itself is not pulling in any way at the exterior, so that we can trust the shape of the wool that we cut. Here's both pieces complete, ready to move forward with the next steps. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Matthew Nagy.